I'm very, very excited today to speak with Camilla Marcus, who is joining us from New York today. Camilla is the chef and founder of Westbourne, which is a restaurant in Manhattan with a zero waste approach and with like a very social approach as well, which she will explain in a second. She worked before also at Union Square Hospitality Group, Del Anima, River Park, Union Square Cafe, and is also trained in business and law. So also very interdisciplinary background, which we love because we think that it's very important to have. Just a few organizational things. So we will talk to, or I will ask Camilla a few questions to give everyone a background and especially talk on her newest project, the Independent Restaurant Coalition, because it's such an important topic right now during the Corona crisis that we are facing. And we really want you guys to also be included into the conversation. So please feel free, either during the talk over the chat function that you have. So if you go on your screen on the 3 dots that you see, you can go to the chat function and then ask your question or raise your hand. There's a little digital hand that you can raise. So we will see that, and then you can ask actually your question directly. If you don't want to do that during the talk, we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So there's again the opportunity to ask either over the chat or with the raising hand function. And yeah, please feel free to see this as an open conversation and join in. Also share your experiences if you have any that you want to share. If you have any technical problems, there is Carla, my colleague. She's wave again, please. You can also send her a message via the chat function if you have any technical questions. So that is that. I think let's start with our talk and interview with Camilla. Hi, Camilla. Thanks that you're taking the time and that you're here to speak with our participants and our community here in Berlin.
Very honored to be here. So glad to be asked.
Of course. Please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, what your background is. Yeah.
Sure. So I am a chef restaurateur, born and raised in Los Angeles, but found my way to New York in my 20s. As you said, I have a culinary degree, a law degree, and a business degree. I've worked pretty much in every position in a restaurant that you can imagine. Definitely consider myself a little bit more back of the house, if you will. And yeah, I worked for Danny Meyer before starting my own hospitality company, Westbourne. We're about 2.5 years old. And really our whole concept was, you know, rethinking what it means to be a restaurant. So really mission driven and sustainability focused. So we're the first certified zero waste restaurant in Manhattan. Ironically, we got the certification the day of the shutdown. So it's been a very complicated road in the last couple of months. And, you know, we worked with a local nonprofit to invest in hospitality training for youth in the neighborhood. And then we hired from the program. And even within our team, you know, we sort of rethink inside and out all of our systems and programs to encourage wellness, training, education, and cross-disciplinary approach to what it means, again, to sort of have a restaurant operation. So everyone trains across all positions. We banished the words front of house and back of house. And the goal was really that, you know, it would be almost like going to a restaurant college, if you will, really learning top to bottom all about an operation. We had no porters, no dishwashers, and everything was really meant to be much more of a flat structure and much more, again, about development, learning, and more collaborative than I think your traditional restaurant. And then starting March with the pandemic, have found myself sort of overnight and pretty shockingly becoming really an activist. So I am a co-founder of the Independent Restaurant Coalition, which is the national organization that's lobbying Congress right now for financial assistance for independent restaurants across our country. And then we also created, I'm one of the co-founders of Relief Opportunities for All Restaurants, ROAR, here in New York. So it's organized pretty similarly to the IRC, but we're focused on New York State. So, we have a very federalist system in the states. The states and the federal government and the city are independent, should be maybe less independent in a pandemic, should be much more collaborative than they are, but alas, that's sort of where we find ourselves. So, I keep telling people, I never spoke to a lawmaker and would not consider myself a political person. I take the right to vote incredibly seriously. I always have. But, March 15th was the first time I ever got on the phone with a lawmaker. And now I spend probably 50% of my time doing that. So, you never know where the road's going to lead, I guess.
Yeah. Did anything that you did before, like studying law, studying business, working in the restaurants that you did before, did any of this like prepare you for the position that you're in right now?
I think in some ways 100%, and in some ways no. I mean, these are really unprecedented times. Certainly right now, legislation does involve a certain element, obviously, of understanding the law. So I do think I have a little bit of an edge, given my legal background and just understanding sort of how that process works. But like I said, I've never been part of a political process. I've never pushed a piece of legislation through Congress. So, I'm learning sort of in a crash course along with everyone else. But look, I think it's the first time that chefs and restaurateurs, have gotten in the game really for themselves. I think we've relied too much on sort of other agents to be our representatives and to, protect us, if you will. And I think that it's pretty amazing and inspiring to finally see, to see our industry as operators really step up and push for ourselves. So I think all of it prepares you. I mean, you can't sort of advocate something, I think, to the fullest extent if you don't really understand and live it. And, an agent isn't bearing the same stakes, I guess, as your own business. So I think there's sort of a different heat behind it when, it is do or die for all of us. And the consequences of our advocacy, are going to be ours to bear.
When I often talk to politicians or to people that are not in the industry, it's often really difficult to explain why are restaurants so important, and especially in your case, like why is it so important to lobby for them and to save them? In your case, like why do politicians need to understand the impact that we have? Can you just give a short overview how it is for you in the US?
It's so interesting because in March, when all of us shut our doors, we obviously realized millions of people across our country are going to be unemployed overnight. Not a single lawmaker understood that. And I think, interestingly, when we started sharing the statistics, there's 11 million people who work in independent restaurants. 2/3 of restaurants around the country are independently owned, not chains, which tend to be the focus of American politics and legislation. 10% of restaurants are in New York. Almost 1 million people work in restaurants in New York. We're the second largest employer in the country, second to healthcare. And not only that, who do you think are the second responders? Who do you think's feeding frontline workers? Ironically, though, all of those stats were shocking. People had no clue. I mean, our government, to what you said, I mean, I don't know. They just don't look at the data, but the numbers are there. And I think the transition has been, I think what's happening in the States is actually a little bit behind Europe. We have really institutionalized and professionalized as an industry. I think we were sort of seen as hobbyists and, really small businesses and kind of ad hoc. Over the last 10 years, it's really become a career path. I mean, I even remember when I told my college guidance counselor I was going to go to culinary school and work in restaurants. She said, well, like, no one does that. What are you doing? And now my alma mater has a food focused magazine. They have a hospitality concentration. They have part of their career services focused on our industry. I do think that has changed, but I think that government has just not caught up, unfortunately. And I think so much of where we find ourselves is a result of that. And I think, look, the vibrancy, the safety of our streets, the culture and why people travel to different cities is so driven by food, especially over the last 10 years. We see it in media. Food has never been more important. I think it's always been a universal language, but I think it's risen to be even more important culturally. But the biggest piece that lawmakers are missing is employment. We are one of the last frontiers for a true entry level, zero barrier to entry job that has long-term career prospects. You can always get a job in a restaurant in any city in the world. It's just not that many industries where you can do that. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to graduate high school. You
don't have to speak the language necessarily.
And you could have made a mistake in life, and gotten a second chance. I mean, my favorite line to tell lawmakers now to shame them is, when was the last time you hired someone without a college degree? Half my team never went to college. So who's hiring them? If you're not protecting these jobs, if you're not valuing this industry for at least the employment that it sits, which I think is critical to a thriving middle class, you're missing the boat, because no one else is going to absorb them. That's the problem. So unfortunately, I think, lawmakers are living in an era that has passed. And I think that they are getting a rude awakening to have to wake up to what the reality is, that I think we in the industry have known and have experienced over the last decade, that I just think our government has been too slow and too rigid, I think, to catch up to.
Plus, there's a big chunk in the industry that is so under the radar. Like you said, like now there is these numbers and people are like looking at the numbers and are collecting them. But before that, I mean, I don't think we even have the numbers of all the undocumented workers, right? Like
that's a whole other, that's a whole other element. And given where we are politically in the States, as you'll see in a lot of articles and movements, that I sort of see, unfortunately, as phase two. We have to sort of save the industry to then unearth what is being very much buried beneath. But yes, immigrants and undocumented workers is a huge part of this. The challenge is that's very politicized in the States. So there's, those who feel that has value and those who feel that it doesn't. I very much believe it does, but unfortunately, they're sort of, because of the political environment, two separate issues. But it is a big part. All those numbers don't include, again, you're correct, anyone who's not a citizen.
Yeah, but I think it's now, like you said, people are stepping up for our industry, basically, and are also showing that we are part of a system that also has a lot of effects on other things like climate change, right? Like the way we purchase produce has a lot of effects on also other industries in the end.
And that's the hardest part about what's happening too. So 11 million workers work in independent restaurants, again, 15 million across the industry. That doesn't include our supply chain, florists, bread makers, farmers. You think about all the people, plumbers. I had 30 employees before the shutdown, and I probably work with 100 vendors. They also stopped on a dime when we stopped. So the biggest challenge that I think is what we're also trying to fight against and fight for is, look, this whole focus in the pandemic on hygiene has brought a resurgence of plastic and single-use items. Everyone's sort of racing to the bottom dollar again because money's tight. And our independent farming system is the most at risk. Ironically, people don't realize their livelihood is dependent on restaurants. We're the ones that buy from the small farmer. Most people don't connect to their food system and their food sources in the same way. They get there through restaurants, and certainly big chains are not doing that. They're working with the Purdue's of the world, not, an upstate Hudson Valley farmer. So there's a lot at risk and a lot of ramifications for all the progress that we've made on climate change, which certainly still has a way to go. But that's also part of this crisis that I think is in the balance, and I think not as much in focus as it probably should be.
Yeah. We are already pretty further. I want to go take a step back for a week. How did the coalition start, actually? Like, how did you team up? And now you're like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like 500,000 restaurants that came together, right? So how did you get everyone together, and was there already a collaborative spirit before that?
I do think restaurant people all know each other. It's sort of like everyone's 6 degrees of separation. And I used to always say, we're much more collaborative and connected than other industries, despite the fact that it's a very competitive business, because we all know each other. We've all worked together. We always say like restaurant lineages. It's like, we're all cousins to some extent. And look, no person is eating at one restaurant for every meal every day. So at the end of the day, it's not really zero sum the way it is. You have one mobile platform you're using, right? Like you're not using more than one. So it is zero sum. And so they can't really work together. We're much more collaborative than I think people realize. So I do think that connectivity was already there. The way we formed was really honestly ad hoc. We closed our doors on March 15th. I started making phone calls to restaurateurs in New York that I knew, one of them being Tom Colicchio, who I had worked with on River Park many years ago. And I said, it's very clear that the government does not see what's happened. We all know that millions of people just got fired across the country. They have no clue. In fact, we crashed the Department of Labor site that Monday morning, and they started staggering applications by letter. So some people who applied on Monday wouldn't get to reapply for 2 Mondays after that. So the numbers we knew were going to be extraordinarily delayed. And we also knew that the government really had no clue what was happening. So we started forming, essentially Roar started out of, myself and 3 other people. We sort of did a phone tree, and I said, look, let's get as many people on the phone who own as many independent restaurants so we can really take a tab of, big, small, whether you have a grocery component, whether you don't, whether you're in Brooklyn or upstate or Harlem or the city, let's get a cross swath and figure out, like, is everyone seeing what we're seeing? And if so, then we got to do something about it. And so when I called Tom Colicchio, he said, I'm in, but just FYI, this is also happening at the national level. I want you to jump on and help the IRC. We're just in the process of forming for the very same reason. We need money, and we're concerned. The IRC formed out of really necessity. I mean, the third relief package that was passed by our Congress, they had only invited public chains like the McDonald's of the world to the White House to discuss relief, financial relief for the industry. Again, like I said, 2/3 of restaurants are independently owned, and we had not one seat at the table. So the IRC was really formed out of necessity, feeling that we weren't considered, we weren't taken care of, and the National Restaurant Association, which has traditionally was supposed to exist to consider our part of the market, very clearly was not representing our interests. And so I think we all just really, it was sort of old school phone tree style. I mean, that's the truth. And I think it was just, everyone got pushed off the same cliff. It didn't matter if you were famous, didn't matter if you had 20 restaurants, didn't matter if you had, 1,000 square foot restaurant in Soho. We all were facing the exact same crisis, and we all saw the future with a lot of fear that the government really didn't understand what was happening and wasn't going to be capable of addressing the issues the way that we needed. So it was really a fight for a seat at the table, and a feeling that if we didn't get in the game, the millions of people that are supposed to be in our care, are going to be boats without a paddle.
Who are the restaurants that can join the coalition? Like, what are the boxes you have to tick to become?
Just independently owned. So, okay. Not massively, private equity backed, not public. For the most part, the goal is not, I forget what the actual criteria is, but, not chains. So you can't have the same restaurant name with, 30,000 locations across the country. It's interesting. It's actually it's funny you asked that. It's been one of the constant debates since we started because, take Let Us Entertain You in Chicago, for example, the Melman family. I consider them independent. Now they're large and they have a lot of restaurants and they're a very large, very successful, well-funded company, but they built one restaurant at a time, by one family. To me, I don't consider that a chain the way that, we look at chains as there's a franchisee component, a lot are publicly listed, their access to capital is just very different. Even when you're large, if you're privately owned right now, you can't just like go out and get millions of dollars to help your relief. So I think it was about think it's about ownership, and I think it's about access to capital, and I think it's about how you approach your business, and you really do own every single business. It's not like a franchise model where it's very disaggregated. So it's been a constant definition. I would say that's a work in progress.
And so you said it was initially founded because you needed a seat at the table. You needed to get together and have like a bigger voice in the end, right? Like to have like the same voice as a McDonald's or as a Wendy's or whoever was at the table. I remember that information, the news that came, and I was very upset about it. But tell us the next steps. What happened when you got together? What are the strategies that you're following now?
We hired two marketing firms, and we hired the best lobbyists in DC. And we fundraised the heck out of it so we could have the best of the best representing us. And we arranged a number of meetings in Congress, but also with the White House. And about a month ago, successfully put up a bipartisan, bicameral bill called the Restaurants Act. So we're calling for $120 billion in financial aid, which is starting to really gain a lot of traction and a lot of support, again, across parties, and both in the Senate and the House. And so our hope is that within the month, we have secured financial aid, which again was the goal, starting in March. And I think what we've seen as well is, I think we are at the table, and I think for good. And I do think that the government and the public and our industry now recognize that it was a big hole, and that, again, if 2/3 of our industry is independently owned, but we're not well represented, that's a problem. All of those people, their interests are not being protected. And, we're not like chains. We're not publicly listed. We have more minority and women-owned businesses than chains. So, it's also about inclusion and diversity, and about thinking about who we want to be encouraging and protecting during this time.
So, and what is the fund exactly providing for you as a small restaurant owner?
So the goal is to give grants to make up for the lost income since the pandemic. So similar to what, we shared the statistic back in April or March, restaurants in New York employ as many people as airlines do as an entire industry across the country. So we employ more in one state than airlines do nationwide. They received a financial bailout week one. They received a full bailout, and mind you, they were not closed down, and they have not been shut down for one day, and they received financial aid in that third bill in mid-March. So we're essentially just asking for the same for an industry that, totally eclipses that and has been hit drastically harder. And again, remember, no access to capital. So interestingly, the bailout for airlines was equal to the stock buybacks that their executives did the prior year, which is incredibly wrong. And again, they all issued bonds and securities to raise additional funds in the public market the week after receiving a bailout. We don't have that ability. Nope. Our businesses aren't even viable for debt right now. Mm-hmm. I keep saying, a lot of politicians want it to be debt, not a grant. And I said, well, we don't even know if we're allowed to open tomorrow. Tomorrow you could close us down. Tomorrow we could do indoor dining. The next day not. How can you put debt on a business where we literally don't even know if we have to fire our entire teams in another month when it gets cold? How on earth can you put debt on a business like that? I don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that's a bad equation.
Yeah. Say the fund goes through, I think it's until the end of the year. The numbers would support until the end of the year, or the fund would support. This is a fairly short-term support, and definitely it's needed 100%. I'm just wondering what your view is on. I don't think we realize. Sorry?
I don't think it'll be the last. It is short-term. And look, it's taken us almost 6 months to get attention and due consideration for it, but you have to start somewhere.
Exactly. And I would like to know more about what your view is, because I think we have seen now anywhere in the US more dramatically than here maybe, but we have seen that our industry is very fragile on a lot of levels, be it from the farm level, but also like in our structures where we live from, how do you say this, mouth to
hand to mouth.
Hand to mouth. I'm wondering what your view is, what really has to change in the long run for the industry to become more resilient. And
I mean, look, I think reform in a more structural way is on the table and something that we're all pushing for as a longer term strategy. And I think now is the time. You know, the industry average profitability went from 20% 10 years ago to 5% now. We pay 30% in corporate taxes as an industry, which is pretty mind-boggling for how many people we employ. I think there's going to have to be major shifts. I think real estate incentives and how that's structured is going to have to change. You know, the one piece I don't think will, and I don't know that I think it should, you know, rising food costs is just, I think, sort of inevitable and necessary. But I also think there needs to be, frankly, more public awareness as well of what it really costs to eat out. You know, that's the challenge competing with a McDonald's. People believe a meal costs $2. Well, it doesn't. And no one wins when your meal costs $2 except the stock price, right? You know, the farmer does not win when things are really a race to the bottom. So I think that element won't change, but I do think there needs to be a lot of labor reform. We're a very litigious culture and country, and I think that's also played a big part in, you know, how do we think through labor and protecting the right kinds of behaviors without being sort of, you know, all we're doing right now is funneling cash to lawyers. And I think that that pattern also has to be adjusted at some point. So I really do think every level of the industry is going to have to be restructured with the help of government. And I think we do have to get closer to double digits and reapproach more of that 20% profitability, because we can't take care, you know, everyone keeps talking about, oh, well, we want to do this and we want to do that. And why can't restaurants take better care of their people? It's like, when you're on a 5% margin, how? You know, everyone wants to pay more, but there's not margin to reinvest. I mean, it's just impossible. So, you know, it is going to require really a full scope restructuring, I think, to help wake up the country that this is an important industry. It's critical for our middle class. It's critical for so much along our supply chain. And unless it becomes a stable business, it just won't be able to, you know, it won't be able to provide that any longer. And I think we're already feeling the effects. I mean, you walk down our streets and when restaurants are closed the way they are, I mean, it's sad. And not to mention, you know, I keep reminding again, lawmakers, you know, we have 1 in 4 people unemployed come from our industry. This country cannot sustain that level of added people on social services. You know, we aren't socialist and we aren't structured the way a lot of European countries are. Our system cannot sustain that. So we either have to change the system or we have to rethink, you know, incentives and what it means to operate a hospitality business so that it can be privately, you know, privately supported and that people can be reemployed and back to work. You know, even in the early days of the shutdown, one of the biggest challenges was in our country, again, health insurance comes through your employer. So when everyone was fired, the biggest issue was, well, what can the government do to encourage people to be furloughed so their employers still pay for health insurance? We're in a health pandemic and everyone was not only out of work, but no insurance. I mean, it's a huge problem. Yeah. So again, the scope and scale, I think, is something that is going to have to be massively reimagined.
I want to ask my last question, and then I want to open up the Q&A, because I want to talk a little bit more about you already thinking about working at a restaurant at Westbourne. Like, what were the projects that you were already implementing even before the pandemic for your team and for your staff?
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot very differently. So all of our pre-shifts included sort of open forum feedback sessions, and then coupled with meditation. So we did a meditative exercise before every single shift. As I said, we're cross-trained. All team members are cross-trained, and so everything was related to really, again, education and development. No porters, no dishwashers. Everyone paid the same. Pay increases were based on number of stations trained in, so it was really a merit-based system. And then we had what's called, we called it Embrace Your Side Hustle Fund. So $35 every single month to do really anything to develop yourself as a person. So it could be eating at another restaurant, it could be going to a museum, it could be a yoga class. A lot of individuals we had used it to give to charity, and they did, walkathons, and that was their entry, or they asked to just donate it to a charity, which we supported. So I think for us, it was about, we did full 360 reviews for every single team member twice a year, which is pretty unheard of in our industry. Even part-time and hourly employees don't often get that kind of structural, professional training, really. So really our goal inside and out was to think about, how can we make someone bring their whole self to work? How can we give them the tools to improve their wellness? I mean, it's a very high intensity and stressful, job, as you know. And I always remind people, it's like doing your job on stage all the time. I mean, the pressure is incredible. And so a lot of our training also involved, helping people recenter themselves and giving them the tools to take care of themselves and stay sort of calm and help keep grounded during, a very intense job. Our future goal, at some point, and I believe in this sort of as a larger thing too, is really improved sort of operational training, financial education, and really teaching people. I mean, there's so many times where I'll meet people who are GMs from restaurants, and like, they don't even know how to read a P&L. It's like, I don't know how this person is the general manager. They don't understand the finances. And, again, when these are very intense operating businesses that run on razor thin margins, it's hard. You have to pay someone who's training, who's not on the job when, money's tight. That's really hard. So again, my hope is that we can improve margins so that reinvestment in our teams can start to be more the norm.
Nice. I want to open up for questions from you guys, from the participants. Please actually, I would like you to ask directly. We're going to try this out now. Last time we did it a lot over chat, but I think it's actually really nice. If you want to ask a question, either just unmute yourself and then ask, or raise your hand, your digital hand, and please ask. Otherwise, I have a million other questions for you, so we'll be covered. Meldet sich jemand? No? No? All right, then I'll continue a little bit. I was also thinking that, or we can see it here, that also now a lot of people are just changing professions. Like, they are just fed up with the system. Can you hear me?
Yep.
And are changing professions. And I was really wondering, like, how do you see, do we need to actually give incentives and change the restaurant industry as well in general, because we will not find skilled staff anymore? Or do you say, no, actually it's a good thing because we were anyway so oversaturated with workers?
No, I mean, I think I'm in the former camp personally. Again, I'm sort of a hopeless optimist, maybe a reckless optimist. Look, I do think people are going to switch careers. I'm sure, everyone is experiencing this in their own community. I think every one of my friends, regardless of what industry they work in, this great pause that we've all had, and, also our health and our lives, really being put at the forefront of how fragile it all is. I think people are reexamining everything, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I keep calling it the Great Reckoning, and I think it's a time for all of us to decide what we value, what kind of society we want, what kind of people we want to be, and where we really want to spend our time and energy. If, time is short, it is the most precious resource we have. So I don't see it as a bad thing, but I also don't think it'll be a massive flight. I think, if anything, those that really are passionate about the industry, I think, have doubled down and have said, you know what, this is worth fighting for, and we see how it can be better. I do think a lot about the industry has to change. And I think this has just been a grand flashlight on, the cracks that already existed before. But I think it's an opportunity to reimagine it. And I think, again, I do think there's a very central value of this industry, both to the culture and fabric of our communities, but also as I said, really economically and employment wise. So I don't know. I think I fall in the former category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. And I do also think that there is like a time frame now where there is a lot of time also for owners to rethink how to structure their teams and how to how to get together also in their teams. How was it for you and your team members? Like what was
the biggest challenge with that in the States is that state by state and city by city, even the regulations are so different.
All right.
And they really, I think what we have tried to shed light on is it's like running a business handcuffed. You know, the ability to rethink and reshape teams is very difficult in our country. We are way overly regulated. We have become overly regulated and overtaxed over the last decade to a point that is honestly just unrealistic. And they're decisions made by people who clearly don't understand how the industry works. So for example, you know, we keep trying to explain to lawmakers, post-pandemic, teams are going to have to be much more cross-collaborative. Ironically, I'm seeing friends of mine who told me the Westbourne system was ludicrous. No one will ever want to work in that environment. Who wants to cross-train, blah, blah, blah. Now everyone's doing it. And I keep hearing on our calls, wow, you know, I had a line cook package something and serve it to a guest for the first time. Like, it was wild. And I'm thinking, wow. But, you know, the system is really unfortunately regulated so granular, like with such granularity, that so many of those changes that I think would help our businesses in the long term, we're going to have to fight to take the handcuffs off, because it really isn't realistic post-pandemic and really should never have been there to begin with. You know, I keep trying to explain to lawmakers and to our government, it's like in any other business, if you have an accountant and, you know, someone on your finance team who do somewhat similar things, right? And they're working on the same project. It's all about the financial health of the company. Our regulations in our industry basically treat both of those people like, you know, they're Venus and Mars, and like never the twain shall meet. And, you know, it really makes it difficult to be collaborative and I think to be as innovative with our models as possible. So it is one of the big things that we are fighting to, you know, frankly, get more freedom and independence on, because it is going to be necessary going forward.
Do you feel like a change as just an owner with your team, that you reacted differently or that you did things differently? No.
Myself, you know, for the first 4 weeks, we actually kept our entire team paid for. We did full pay for the first month, and we did partial pay for the second month, and we did an entire work from home program. So we did a bunch of certifications, trainings, education, meditation, and we really tried to keep the team as engaged as possible, because I could see how inept the Department of Labor and unemployment benefits were, and I really didn't want our teams and their families, you know, being food insecure and not, you know, feeling like they could pay rent, you know, falling off a cliff right away. So we really smoothed things out. And I think we took a very sort of people-centric and more generous approach, I think, than most. And look, part of that is also our size is both an advantage and a disadvantage. You know, we're small, so we really can. And dollars and cents, it's not nearly as much as having, you know, 1,000 employees is obviously, you know, not many people can sacrifice that much money. So we were lucky in that sense. The downside is we are small, and for COVID and health and safety, being a small restaurant is like a death sentence right now. So, you know, we benefit in some ways and we don't in others.
Right. I think there's also a good, how do you call this? Like, I think it's also, when we talk about the importance of independent restaurants, first of all, you have the ability to support your employees better, which in big companies is like, they were the first ones to let people go, right? So I think that was a good point, which we also saw here actually, where just founders.
Those decisions are less personal, right? You know, if you're a franchisee, you don't even think you get to decide that. You know, there's just a different control mechanism. I think there's a different sort of personal connectivity that happens when you're a much larger company. And like I said, too, look, scale is tough. And if you're publicly listed, you don't get to make a lot of those decisions in the same way. You don't have the same level of control. So, you know, that is a big factor, I think, for a lot of different reasons, but it is a big differing factor, I think.
And what do you think, or can you also, we touched a little bit already on it, but like the importance of restaurants for communities, neighborhoods, what is your emphasis, or like what do you tell politicians on that, in that sense?
Thankfully and horrifically, we don't really have to even tell them anymore because they're living
Right.
what we told them in March would happen. You know, when you walk down the street and you don't have restaurants open, you know, we're the ones that are open past 5. We're the ones that make evenings in major metropolitan cities feel safe. You know, everyone, it was actually my birthday and my husband and our 10th wedding anniversary, literally the week after the shutdown in New York. I can tell you, spending a major milestone not being able to celebrate was brutal. You know, it's like every person who's had a birthday in COVID now really misses restaurants. You know, you forget that person who asked you, you know, how your day was, where you celebrate big milestones, where you gather with your friends. I mean, we are so part of people's lives in such an intimate way that I think, again, has been really undervalued and I think underappreciated. You know, you don't realize how much it means to you, right, until it's gone. And I think, you know, sadly, everyone is experiencing it now firsthand. And I think when you walk down streets in neighborhoods really across our country and you realize, you just really do realize how much we are the fabric and the heart of the nation, whether you're a small town or New York City. I mean, it changes the entire feeling. And like I said, you know, and we are really pushing hard on the New York government for this very reason. I mean, a huge driver of tourism and visitation is revolving around dining out. I mean, it's a huge magnet and a huge driver, again, not just economically, but to bring people from all around the world. I mean, you know, I was on an Instagram live a couple months ago with Renee Redzepi, and we were talking about sort of the differences between how our governments have handled things. I said to him, you know, I was 8 months pregnant, and I went to Noma for literally 2 days. A friend invited me, and like you know, that is the reason I went to Copenhagen for that trip, you know, and it was such a special experience. I still think back to it. And, you know, we all have those memories, right, of going to a place, or the highlight of a trip being that local pub you randomly stumbled into, or you know, met. How often do you travel and you meet someone wonderful who's sitting at the table next to you? I mean, I literally have friends for life that I met sitting next to them at a restaurant. So we are social beings. I mean, that is what makes us human. And I do think that this has put that in really sharp focus. And I do think the cultural piece is something that, like I said, sort of sadly, we don't have to paint that picture anymore because we're living it now, especially here in the States where things have really not gone back to normal.
Talking about community, like did you exchange a lot with other people from other countries, like Renee, for example, and did that help you in the last months, or did you find any, like, I don't know, synergies or anything that, or was it so hugely different that you can't even adapt it in any other way?
Look, I think our community has come together across the world. I mean, I'm also lucky. I have friends that live around the world and, you know, from all different experiences. And I think it helps us all get solace, but I think that it's also equally depressing because I think we all are facing the same thing. I think there's lessons and learnings of how each is approaching it, but I also think, you know, again, for better or worse, but, you know, vis-a-vis us, the sad part is, you know, our government just hasn't stepped in the way that it has in other countries. So I think we're seeing and we're learning, and it's helping inform a lot of our advocacy. I mean, a great example of that is, you know, New York City is resisting experimenting with indoor dining, and we're pushing the mayor, you know, with incredible force that look at we're New York City. I mean, this is one of the greatest cities in the world. How can we be so afraid to take the next step? You know, we need to be much more transparent with what the metrics are. What are the health protocols? You know, what makes indoor dining safe and possible? It's happening all over the world. You can't say it's impossible, and you can't just shut down that option. You just can't. So I do think talking with people from around the world helps us with best practices, what's possible, and thinking through different ideas. I mean, you're seeing every country really approach things so differently. So I think it's critical. And I think it's one of the problems. I do think, we Americans tend to be somewhat arrogant and somewhat us-centric. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from, especially when it comes to restaurants and sort of how to do it safely, how to reopen safely, from around the world that, I don't think we're fast enough to uptick on. And look, the truth is, we botched it anyway from the shutdown. We had fair warning. We weren't the first city. We were far from the first city. New York City had fair warning. And I think the way it was handled was atrocious. And again, shows really a lack of international connectivity. I mean, like I said, we had fair warning shots. We knew it was coming weeks in advance and no plan was put in place. And we're paying the consequences of it.
What is
all day long? Like I said, I mean, I have very dear friends who live in Milan. I have friends who live in China. I have friends who live in Seattle. And it was very clear what was happening. And our government was telling us really the opposite. Like, it's not going to get here. It's not going to get here. It's not going to get here. Well, that's not a strategy.
No. So what do you wish for the future, kind of? Sorry, this is a big question. I mean, you can choose what you want to.
Look, but I wish for a future where restaurants hold the proper place in, I mean, I would say around the world, but right now I am focused on the States, given where we're at. I mean, I want us to hold the position and value and appreciation that, frankly, is long overdue. Like I said, next to healthcare, we're the second largest private employer. We are equally first responders. When the shutdown happened, our industry kicked into gear to feed our cities. We are community anchors. And I think the systems, the regulations, and the financial structures need to be restructured and reworked in a way that will help our industry that is trying to reform and move into a new phase in a new generation and take it to the next level in a way that I think us as independent owners know that it can be. I think we're ready for sort of a new age.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a perfect last sentence. Yeah, I think so too, and that's what we try. And I think that's global, right? Like the validation for restaurateurs, for chefs has gotten better, but also for the food producers that are behind it. And I think it's definitely for us to do. Sorry.
It needs to be seen and respected as a real valuable industry, again, both financially, but even more so sort of culturally and socially, in a way that just hasn't really happened today. Even in the beginning of the shutdown, I was told by someone, I was on a call similar to this with about 500 real estate owners and companies from around the country. And one guy goes, it's like our business and your hobby. And I said, excuse me? I go, sorry, I employ 10 times more people than you. And technically I'm smaller. Like, this is not a hobby. It's not he called it a project. I'm like, this isn't a project. This is business just like yours is. This is part of the problem. So I agree with you. I think it's about the industry being elevated and valued in a way that it frankly should have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's why your work is super important, that there's people who actually can communicate it also so well and speak with the politicians, because not everyone in our industry can or is good at it. So I think it's very important that you got together in our voice for everyone. And that's why I think also this whole topic of collaboration and supporting each other in different ways is very, very important for our future, for the whole industry, honestly.
We appreciate what you're doing as well. And again, I was very honored to be asked. I hope this was helpful, valuable for everyone who shared their time. I know, like I said, that's our most valuable resource. I'm very grateful.